Hi, and welcome to my video about how to make hills and cliff faces. So to do this, we start with our regular modular tile. Because this tile is supposed to connect with other tiles, I begin by marking the corners where it's supposed to match up with them. I always match my tiles at the corners, that way I can set them up differently every time and I get more use out of them. Once this is done, I draw with a Sharpie on the tile the shape that I want to cut the hill to, and I mark it to show hill faces or a height gradients, in which case I write the numbers for the height gradients, and when I do this I mean gradient by layers of foam. Once this is done, I put my first layer of foam on and I mark where it's supposed to align with the tile and where it's supposed to be cut. Once this is done, I'll take my foam cutter and I'll cut it out. Now, because of the shape of the foam cutter, you might not be able to cut it all in one go, so don't be afraid to use a knife to finish off the cut. And anyway, we're going to sand it down later, so don't worry about those weird edges. I take the foam that's left over from cutting the first layer and I start layering it over the first layer. I do this to do this well. I align it on the table and then I take some toothpicks and I push them all the way through to the base. That way they don't shift while I mark them, and later I can take them all out together as one piece and cut them to shape. Now when I do this, when I'm cutting them with a wire cutter, it's best to do all the layers together. That way I get my edges to align perfectly with each other and create nice gradual slopes and not stiff slopes. Now I also want to be able to have some use from the back of the tile, so I want the back of my tile that will otherwise align with a different tile to also be able to be used as a cliff side with some nice interesting caves. So I angle my foam cutter down at the bottom, making sure not to cut the top of the hill. That way the top will align with other tiles, while the back can be used to simulate a hill face. Now in this part of the hill, I decided to make a gradual slope where I can place my minis as if they're climbing up. To do this, I used the foam cutter to eat away at the slope gradually to create my initial slope, measured it of course with the mini, and then took some sanding paper to sand everything down. Now I should say that this isn't the actual piece that I made for the big tiles because I lost the video. So for the rest of the video, I'm going to use the actual pieces that I made for the tiles shown on the Dungeon Facebook page. Now, if I want to make a cliff, I basically do it the same way I did the hill. I create the layers and then I glue them with the silicone glue. To glue something well with the silicone glue, I apply the glue and then I aerate the glue by pressing them and opening them up. Then I put the toothpicks back in to make sure they don't shift while the glue cures, and I clamp it all down with a set of clamps. Now doing this for a hill is a bit trickier because there are less areas that you can apply the clamps on, and they're at different heights. So to do this, I use smaller pieces of MDF to spread out the pressure on all those wide, flat areas. That way I manage to spread the pressure and actually get all of my hill nicely pressed. Now, once this is done, I take some caulk and I spread it around all of the areas where the connections between the foam pieces is more glaring. And I do this all around the hillside. Now I decided to make my cliff face seem like very chalky, more like a sedimentary rock. So I wanted the layers of rock to be very, very visible. To do this, I took a box cutter knife and my scalpel, and I cut layers basically into the rock, making sure that all these layers stayed perpendicular to each other, as rock layers do in the wild. Now when you do this, make sure not to cut your fingers off. I somehow managed to do this. So be sure to finish the model with the same amount of fingers you started it out with. Once the layers are all cut in, I take a rock and I start bashing away at the rock face. Now don't be gentle while you do this. You want it to be very roughed up and to break off a lot of pieces. This will bring out the layering and create that rough, cliffy feel that you'd like. So I don't hit at a certain angle, I hit at different angles, different strength, and I start chipping away at the pieces that are about to fall off. When this is done, I take my knife and I get a little bit more rough with the cliff, starting to flake off pieces of different layers, making them more readily apparent to the naked eye, cutting out small caves, shelves in the rock. If these things might just occur from your treatment with the rock, but if they don't, so be sure to make them with the knife. Now when I use the knife, I basically stab at the XPF foam and then pull out the knife with a tearing motion to break off the pieces of foam. The edges that you get that way are rougher and will seem a little bit more natural, which is exactly what you want. Now if you want to put a mini on those rock shelves, be sure to check ahead of time to see that it's big enough to fit the mini. Basically continue till you get the effect that you want. Now make sure that if you cut a piece with the knife, make sure to texture it again with the rock or with a ball of tinfoil paper to make sure that you don't get any smooth edges. Once texturing the cliff face is done, I lay down the grid with a ruler on the top of the cliff and use a ballpoint pen to accentuate the grid. Once this is done, I take my rock and tinfoil paper and texture the top of the cliff face. Remember that when you use the rock, it depends on the deepness of the texture depends on how hard you hit with the rock. And when you use the tinfoil, it's how hard you press. So use the base of your hand to create deeper texture with the ball, or just the tips of your fingers if you want light texture. Make sure that you go over all of the corners of all of the edges of the cliff face, and that in case you have a small step at the edge of the grid, make sure to extend your grid down to the lower rock shelves that you have. I take my scalpel and I keep chipping away at the rock face just to perfect the cliff face, and then I go back to my hill and I basically give it the same treatment, creating those rock layers, chipping away with the knife, and bashing away at it with the rock and the tinfoil ball. Now laying down the grid on the hill was a little bit more tricky because of the angle of the hill, but if you use a ruler and you make sure to align all your grid points from the bottom of the tile to the top, you can get a very good approximation of a decent grid. Now I glued my hilltop to an already existing tile that I didn't like that much, and I wanted to turn it into just from a simple road tile to a road by a cliffside tile. I glued it with the same silicone glue, aerating the glue and putting it in place. Then I took some of those foam chips and I started applying them to the bottom of the hill to make small rocky piles. I took some foam blocks that I cut out and I made a tiny ruin at the bottom. These small details, like the ruin, really help to create interest in your tile and turn it from a mundane cliff or a road to something that might just have a story to it. Who lived in the ruin? Why is it ruined now? Maybe there's something to explore there. These things will help draw your players to your tile and into your game, from your tile, sorry, into your game and into your world, which is exactly what we want. I do the same thing with the hillside, only this time because I used a bigger rock to create a little boulder, I made sure to cut the same rock layers into the boulder. That way when it lies on its side, people will see those rock layers and see that this boulder actually fell off of the hillside. I used a small toothpick to fix this boulder to the base of the hill, because heavier boulders, well, they tend to get knocked off if they're not properly glued to the base. When this is done, it's time to put in the rest of our rock piles. To do this, I take sand from different grades, from very fine sand to beach sand, small pebbles, and an assortment of rubble and sand, which is basically construction sand. I take 50-50 PVA and water mixture, some soapy water, and a dripper, and I'll use all of these to create the natural rock piles I'll get in a couple of seconds. Now, in order to build up your rock piles, start by dabbing some glue down on the tile, spread some construction sand over the glue, spray it with the soapy water, and then take the dripper to drip some of the glue mixture on top of the rock pile. Now, a very quick way to do this is by using basically a paper cone as a sand magazine, and just slowly open up the bottom to allow sand to out at the bottom, depositing it exactly where you want and the amount that you want. Now, the secret to doing this well is actually the soapy water. Soapy water wets down the sand and allows the glue to seep into it and really bind all of those small rocks and sand together into one cohesive pile, and prevents it from creating a sand glue glob that you might get if you decided to drip the glue over some dry sand. When this is done, I let it rest for a couple of hours to dry, better in front of a heat source to make it dry faster. Now, as you see, the cone allows me to do this very quickly when I do this over large areas on the hill, and I spread some big rocks to make it look a little different. I hope you liked this video. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you at the next video on how to color the hillside and cliff. And the third one will be over vegetation. These will all come out today. See you later.